This is the PR Podcast, a show about how public relations helps you tell your story to the world. We talk with great PR practitioners who have the skills, creativity, and just plain savvy to get their clients noticed. Now here's your host, Jody Fisher.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the PR Podcast. I'm Jody Fisher. Thanks for joining us. Well, it was a big and busy week this week. Lots of news happening out there, along with the usual political stuff that we always have to wade through. And there were also developments with the COVID Delta variant, hoping that everyone out there is safe, is behaving appropriately, is vaccinated, because vaccines, little soapbox here, the only way we're going to get rid of this, go get your vaccine. But there's also things about the Olympics. And as we're taping this, the opening ceremonies were streamed live this morning. I have some thoughts about that maybe we can get into. Jeff Bezos attempted to go to space. He didn't get to, successful mission, all well and good. I just have a problem with the fact that, people are reporting that he went to space. He dipped a toe into space. There are other people who've actually gone to space. But there was also a lot of PR fallout from the Bezos debacle, including the shape of the rocket. So it was a real crisis PR kind of week. At least I feel it was that way. I was busy working on a new business, taking care of the clients I represent across healthcare, higher ed, financial services, and that little bit of everything category that I just love. Lots of projects in motion. And so looking forward to having some success in the coming days. I also spent some time booking a lot of new guests for the podcast. And I think I have the rest of the summer booked up, which is awesome. And I'm excited about that. But I'm very excited to be talking about today's guest. And we have not just one guest, but two. So let's get right into it. Celeste Katz Marston and Jeff Simmons are the co-hosts of the weekly Driving Forces show on WBAI 99.5 FM radio in New York City. Jeff is an executive vice president at Anat Gerstein Incorporated in New York. It's that city's premier PR firm for nonprofits. He's also a former TV and print journalist. Celeste has covered news, politics, and voting for more than 25 years. She currently freelances for outlets including Neiman Reports and NBC Asian America, and has been on staff at the New York Daily News, Newsweek, and more. Celeste and Jeff, welcome to the PR Podcast.
Great to be here.
Great to be with you and Celeste. I miss Celeste. Haven't spoken with her in 24 hours.
That long.
We're taping this over Zoom as we do each week, and so I got three windows here. We're lined up like the Brady Bunch, and we've all got our little home studios here. So this is a very professional looking operation that we got here, and I love the view that I've got. We only post audio, but I wish this week we could post the video too, because it's very cool. But tell us about
on radio.
Yeah. Well, speaking of radio, right? And I'm an old radio guy myself. Tell us about Driving Forces and how you came to create that show. How long has it been on now?
Well, I think Jeff and I started the program. It was Jeff's brainchild, and then he invited me to come along for the ride. I feel like it was back in the fall of 2018. And it's a public affairs, public policy program. We try to get newsmakers, people who are in government, people who are in activism, lots of different kinds of guests. And we pick a topic. Generally, we pick a topic every program. And then we jump into it with one guest, two guests, sometimes even three guests. And then we have, of course, a listener call segment, which gets very, very interesting at times. And I'm sure Jeff can elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, in fact, one topic that we discuss a lot over the last year has been COVID. We've had health experts on, and also Celeste has been wonderful about booking journalists regularly on the show because they add a very good perspective on any of the issues we talk about.
Yeah, I heard our mutual friend, Jonathan Capehart on just the other day. He is on a professional career role of his own, but a terrific conversation that you guys had around that. Tell us, maybe we could start, since you brought it up, talking about COVID. And since, the news cycle, COVID is kind of making a comeback, sadly, here with the Delta variant and everything that's going on, and some people refusing to be vaccinated. And I saw a report I think it was on CBS News just the other day, about a guy sitting in a hospital bed who literally had COVID and nearly died. And he was asked if he could do it again, would he get the vaccine? And he said no. And I'm still picking my jaw up off the floor. And his reasoning was, let's just say, very steeped in politics and not steeped in science. Let's just leave it at that. How has the last 18 months been with you all covering the news from the perspective of the Driving Forces show?
Well, it's been interesting for a couple of reasons, and we've done it in a couple of ways. One, we have the standard program, where, as Jeff said, we have on guests who are in healthcare policy, who are frontline journalists, who are exploring this, speaking directly to people. We also had at the station a separate series. I think it ended up being 16 or so episodes called New York in Crisis, WBAI's Coronavirus Diary. We did this one-on-one interviews with people, public officials who were trying to deal with this from a policy perspective, people who actually got sick, and then we had people who were taking care of relatives who had Alzheimer's disease. We spoke to an abortion practitioner. We spoke to a woman who was running children's and adults dance instruction program, trying to teach during this thing. We spoke to a NICU nurse who was dealing with women who were having babies and then not able to hold them or spend time with them because of the restrictions involving coronavirus. And Jeff helped me find a lot of these people who spoke to, the many different ways that this affected people. But again, as Jeff alluded to before, and I'm sure he can talk about this, we do have a sort of an interesting demographic a lot of times at our station vis-a-vis people's attitudes towards the virus and specifically towards vaccination.
And just to build on what Celeste had just said, the series that Celeste led early in the crisis, involved, as she said, about 16 installments. But then starting earlier this year, we went back and replayed them and came out of each of those segments with interviews to kind of catch up with each person on what their life has been like since then. And she mentions the one involving Alzheimer's. That one was one of the toughest ones to do a live interview on because it was so emotional as you spoke to this person. It just, some of these pieces really brought you to tears when you heard what people were going through, because what was done in this case, Celeste, you didn't hear Celeste's questions throughout these interviews. You just heard the answers all knit together in such a nice way. You heard their stories.
And that, I think, is a critical component of what reporters and what PR people can do in this context, is help to tell these stories. We've gotten in the last 4 years to a point, I think, in our public discourse where we're more shouting or talking at each other than we are sharing stories and trying to find common ground. And the factual scientific piece of it aside, where like, okay, this is fact, you can't debate that. When we're talking about that middle gray ground of why people feel a certain way, I think we've lost a little bit of the public discourse there. And I think that's where a show like yours can really help. Do you find that sharing those shows brings out the reaction that you want them to with your audience?
In terms of, I think in terms of sparking debate, a lot of times I think that what we do, and Jeff is really good at asking questions that can make news. And he's very good at, I think, both in what he did as a working reporter, even on television, where you end up being sort of, in the face of the camera and so on. I think Jeff was very good at always at drawing out other people's stories and not sort of being the headline. And I think that he does a really good job with that also as a radio host, getting people to sort of share new informations or getting people to open up about their feelings or their perspectives. So I think we're almost moderators on the program, but yeah, we ask questions and we put topics out there and we get callers who are frankly angry, unhappy, dissatisfied, other words I'm not going to use on a family program, but maybe generally not excited. But you know what? They're calling in and they're talking about it, which is great.
And a little insight for your listeners, when Celeste and I were in studio, because I've only been in that studio once and I begged to go in at one point, only because it was a 3-hour show and there were so many moving parts with so many guests. I needed to make sure I was in front of the engineer. But when Celeste and I were in studio, on the wall, going back to the George Carlin days for your older listeners, is the list of the words you're not supposed to say on the radio. So, and I think once or twice I kind of looked up after a guest would say something and be like, oh, that's on that list. One thing we don't go into each episode thinking we're going to try to break news. We want to make major news, but occasionally it just happens. There was one episode where an elected official said to me that someone in her office had tested positive for COVID. And I'm continuing with the show. And maybe an hour after the show, I thought, wait, I don't know if that's been out there in the news yet. So of course I let a reporter know, and he said, yeah, this has not been. The next day someone reported it, and that elected official's PR person was emailing me saying, please do not keep that radio show up. Please do not tell anyone this. I'm like, this was live radio. Your elected official said this.
Wow, making news, making news. That's great. That's great stuff. And that's got to get your PR person juices flowing as much as it does. I would think your journalistic juices flowing, because that journal, you and I both started out as reporters, and that I'm fond of saying that never leaves your DNA. And it's actually a little bit of a secret weapon for a PR person to have worked in a newsroom, to be thinking like a reporter or an editor, and to understand why decisions get made about what gets reported. Do you agree?
Oh, 100%. I tell any nonprofit that I work with, particularly even when we're pitching them for business, I look at everything through the prism of what a reporter would do, what I would do if I were that reporter. Is this a good story? What makes it visual if it's for TV? What are the elements? Has this been done before? Well, this will not work. And I tell them why something won't work. And, and I love telling stories. That's why I love also being on the radio. I'd say 3/4 of my life is in the nonprofit PR world. The other quarter, I almost said the other eighth, the other quarter is in journalism. But Celeste is the diehard journalist, and she checks me. I'm the one who's more biased. She's more level-headed, especially on the radio. She's much more careful. I also do have to restrain myself with some of my opinions, but and Celeste will correct me if I do go too far, right, Celeste?
Yeah, right. You make me sound like such a tough guy. But I mean, I think that the strength of our program is most of the time we let the guests do the talking. The program is really there so people can listen to expert guests, people with experience, people who know what's going on right now or may have just done something interesting. And this is not to say that there are not programs that are super interesting, that are very personality driven, that are very host driven. Maybe listeners like the sound of that person's voice, or they've read something that they've written, or if they've watched them on TV, or whatever the case may be. I think that in our case, people know us and know our work just from having been around New York and been around news and politics in New York for a very long time. But we're sort of using any familiarity with the audience that they may have to bring out something different from a really curated set of guests. And one of the things that's nice about having been in news and in politics, in Jeff's case, so long, is that we know a lot of people, and we have a really great Rolodex. Just dated myself with that reference, but a really good contact list of people who would make interesting guests. And we have relationships with them, not sometimes adversarial, but at least mutually respectful, where they will come on the show and they will share their expertise with people. And it's a good program.
And what's interesting, I just want to interrupt slightly. What's interesting is that while this is a progressive station, we're a public affairs show, as Celeste noted. So we're going to have guests that our listeners in large part won't agree with. We, thanks to Celeste, had Curtis Sliwa on recently, the Republican candidate for mayor here in New York City. And I will say that the guests were more cordial than expected. But they disagreed with him, and then we had earlier from Long Island, someone you probably know well, which is Peter King, former congressman. And I believe we did get a call from someone at that time who was upset that we had him on. But we want, on a public affairs show, to be able to provide listeners with diverse opinions.
Well, that is the point of what you do. And I think in a broader scheme, what journalism does and what reporting does, it's not your job to segment out the news or the points of view where they need to come up, but instead to expose the audience to, and this is where fair and balanced, stealing a tagline there, but this is where fair and balanced and sort of both sides of the story gets lost, I think, because we've got to this point, and going back to my earlier statement about public discourse, we've got to a point where if you disagree with someone, we're demonizing them. And I think the point of our democracy in our republic, I'm going back to my social studies class here, is to share opinions and then to debate them out and, sort of wring them out with each other to get to the best answer. It's not unlike, to really dumb down the analogy, a team of PR people getting in a room and figuring out what the story is and, disagreeing on how you approach it or the story you want to tell or the way you're going to tell it, and then coming up with the best answer. I feel like that's what your show does really well, is expose people to different points of view. We can be cordial to each other and still disagree. If you don't know what the other person is talking about, well, I think that's where we fall down, right?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And we have callers that call in and say that they, have a problem with a guest, or they have a problem with something we said, or sometimes we even get into it with the guests, with the scheduled guests. And that's fine. And you know what? If people want to call in and say that they have an issue with us or with a guest or with the station or with somebody else's show, you know what? That's fine, because you know what that tells us? People are listening to the program.
Well,
They're
and if
listening.
everyone agreed, that would be really boring radio.
Yeah, it's not a way to get people excited, but the fact that people do feel like they can call in, sort of our tagline for the program and for some of our promotional, our carts, whatever, is be heard. Which is kind of a play on the whole thing about it being a radio station, but the idea that people can actually hear themselves, or hear people who are like them, who are just regular New Yorkers or who are interested in the same things, actually being given a voice, where they may not feel that way. They may feel shut out of sort of the quote unquote mainstream media. So we do try to make sure to give people that time so that they can feel like they're participants and that people like them have a say in what's going on.
And I don't have much to add to that, because as I've learned with Celeste, when she's right, she's right. I don't repeat.
What a gentleman.
and that's a good economy of words there for radio, right? Keep it tight. Talking about the guests that you have on and sort of the platform that you have available, and like I said, I'm an old radio guy and have actually done a bit of time in the talk radio world as well, or at least worked on talk radio stations, and not all news radio stations, but actually talk radio stations. There are very pointed opinions that have to come out in those shows, right? And the whole point of the shows is to mix it up a little bit. But in terms of the broader sense of the conversation and the information flow that's getting out there, stepping back from the show that you do you think that journalists and newsmakers are doing a good job of informing, understanding that, I'm in their corner, right? And the job has become harder and harder and harder. And you've got one person doing the job of four these days because the private equity firm that bought the outlet decided to cut the jobs and reduce the health benefits and, all on and on and on. So the newsrooms have been decimated. Still, they have to do the job that they signed up for. What is your opinion of sort of the state of the news business and the decisions that are getting made and what people are choosing to cover?
I think you're absolutely right about what we are seeing in newsrooms across the country and across media, whether it's radio, print, anything, certain newspapers, magazines, in particular. I mean, it really is tragic having, seen what's happened here, seeing, my old paper, a paper that I loved working at, the Providence Journal. That was my first job. Not just the bureau that I used to work in closing, but all the bureaus, pages being cut, staff being cut back, and actually doing a lot of coverage of media right now. I work with the Neiman Foundation at Harvard, and they produce Neiman Reports, which is one of the outlets you mentioned before. And having done some stories recently on how do people get this done when you have these cutbacks, especially when you're losing coverage in rural areas. For example, example, places in this country that really have sort of news deserts. And what does it mean to you if you live 50 miles from the capital and you're getting news about crime or some local activity? It just doesn't have relevance. So I think people are genuinely working really hard when they can work, when they're not being laid off or when they're not being furloughed. I think people are still working valiantly and heroically to cover stuff. But, if you have no travel budget, if they won't pay overtime, on top of that, you have the stresses, economic and otherwise, of a pandemic really jamming up the works. And then you do have these private equity firms buying up, noted media outlets and essentially like moving them out and selling their real estate. I mean, if you're buying a newspaper for the land that it sits on or the building that it operated out of, and not for the people and not for the product, then I don't know. That's been very painful to watch.
My perspective on this is going to be a little different, so I don't repeat Celeste, but it has been really sad to watch a number of outlets downsize uh, and to watch all the layoffs most recently. I mean, what we've seen with the Daily News with buyouts, what we've seen with the Greater New York section, which was much more robust than the Wall Street Journal, then became what, one page, maybe 2 pages, them eliminating those positions and reporters could apply. But from our perspective, Jody and I, um, it becomes difficult to pitch what we know are good stories when fewer reporters are still trying to get their job done. And in addition to that, what I watched with a number of reporters trying to manage their social media to beat other reporters at the same time as getting ready to file their stories. It is a challenge. It is a daily challenge, which then makes you and I, Jody, better at our jobs because we have to be more creative and come up with better angles and better content from our clients to pitch to reporters. It requires us to think better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and my heart breaks for the reporters who I know, who I see in the field. When I see, for example, a tweet of theirs pop up about a story that they're covering, or an Instagram post that pops up about, because I know what they're doing at that moment is they're doing that as fast as they possibly can, because they, like you said, Jeff, they also have to file. And if you're in TV, you have to shoot your stand up, and your cameraman is back in the truck, and you got to log your tape, and you're doing all these things in the course of a few hours, and hoping that the desk doesn't call and shove you off to breaking news that's somewhere else that you've also got to go cover. It's such a tsunami of work for these reporters. And I'm specifically talking about field reporters who are doing this day in and day out. And like you said, Celeste, then put that in the context of the last year and a half of a pandemic where you're literally risking your life being out in the field. And it's mind-boggling to me what the news business has gone through in the last 18 months, much less the last few years. And I wonder where it goes. I guess maybe that's a segue into me asking you both, where does the news and information business go from here? Where do you see it going?
I'm letting Celeste take that one first because because she's good on her feet.
Well, it's really tough. I mean, well, first of all, I hate making predictions, and I'm like super bad at it also, which is, the combination of those things is a good reason to not do it. But I mean, I think we do to an extent see some sort of specialization. And I don't know if it's specialization or siloing, but there are a lot of general readership newspapers that had big staffs that had different sections that covered a lot of things really well and really meaningfully. But, how do you now run a general readership newspaper that has an entertainment section when you're competing with the wires, television, and specialty publications? It's like, am I going to break more news about Hollywood than the Hollywood Reporter or Variety or something like that? So, and I don't have enough people to do it. Do I really really need a television reviewer? Do I really need an arts critic? Do I really need a music reviewer? And it's unfortunate because I think you will see more and more of those positions cut and consolidated, and either people moving out to using wire services or just not offering those services entirely. And I think that does go back to what you see about the idea of news deserts, where there is a rich culture in the United States of art and music and theater and so on, but covering it on a local level when somebody has to be covering car crashes and the school board and the city council or town council, and is also shooting their own video, making their own photographs, and laying out their own stories. I used to make a joke when I worked in print publications full time. I said, you know what? I don't write the headlines, I don't take the pictures, and I don't deliver you a newspaper. And you know what? Now all those things might be true. And so I think that what you will see is more and more pressure on fewer people to do more things. And I just don't think that's going to work.
And I'm glad you said that, because we forgot to mention it earlier about reporters also having to take their own photos, because we've watched newsrooms just eliminate many positions for photographers as well. I think also we have to think of where the three of us live. We live in an area with a heavy concentration of media compared to a number of other regions across this country. So we're fortunate. And that, let's just look at the daily news and how it has just completely downsized and how thin it is right now. And I'm still a daily news reader. But at the same time, I've watched how much wire copy winds up in a lot of these publications, as Celeste has noted. And I thought, well, I'm getting this already online. So do I need to really read a pick up a hard copy of
and pay for it?
And pay for it? Pay, what is it, $2 a day now? I got to think of how much it is each day. Do I want to pay for that? Or I'm going to get most of this online already. But I still, I'm still a print reader of the New York Times, for instance, not going to give that up. I also enjoy reading online because the three of us are always on the go. So we're always going to want to read things on our phones or on our tablets. I do worry about the future of journalism. In talking to younger, and I'm doing air quotes that people can't see on a podcast, but journalists right now, I'm surprised often at how, I will say, inexperienced they are compared with the schooling and experience that Celeste had gotten, that I had gotten, that you had gotten. And I feel like I'm also educating them on, no, this is what you need to know. I'm stunned at how often journalism students even call us with questions. I'm like, you got to do your homework before you call. It's, if you want to be a good journalist, don't call me and ask tell me what your organization is. You should have already known that before you called to find out, to report this one specific story. So I could go on and on about this.
That will be another episode, but I agree with you, Jeff, that I've had a similar experience in having to, what I'll say, unnecessarily explain certain baseline things to journalists and to I'm going to say assignment editors, right? People who are working, younger people who are working the day. And I'm not taking shots at the younger people. They're doing their best. I get it. But I also think that I agree with you that they haven't been schooled in the way that we got schooled. And I'll say it flat out, yelled at, humiliated in the newsroom. You need that thick skin when you're a journalist, and that's the only way you get it.
But that's where the benefit of remote work comes in, because you're not yelled at in front of everyone.
Right, exactly. You're not dressed down in front of all your peers. What stories, sort of like, let's sort of round this up now. Who are some of the leading outlets that you see? Let's, flip the script. We've talked about sort of the decimation maybe of journalism, or the decline of journalism. Who are some of the outlets you're seeing who are doing a good job, or where do you see the sort of like the spark or the light?
Do you want me to start? Celeste, you can start.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I mentioned the New York Times. I'm always reading that. But online, I do, because, of course, think of what our show is. I follow politics as much as I can. So I'm reading the Washington Post. I'm reading Politico a lot, and fortunately I have access to Political Pro. So I'm getting a lot of that better insight. I really have a soft spot for the Daily Beast. I love reading the Daily Beast. And of course, especially if David Friedlander listens to this, I do read New York Magazine as much as possible.
Yeah, it's a tough question because I feel like I get my information, just the way I get information now is so different from the way I used to, getting feeds or using apps like Smart News or, newsletters. I think that some of these platforms actually, some of them are pretty overrated in terms of getting great quality news, but there are people actually who do live casts on Instagram where they go through the headlines and then they talk to people. And some of these people are former news people where they actually explain things in a really personal and engaging way. Also to keep on top of the business, for example, I think the Pointer Institute puts out a lot of great stuff in terms of what's going on in the media. I read newsletters like Current, for example, to keep tabs on what's going on in the radio business specifically, which I find very interesting. But for standard news, I mean, look, the wires still do a great job. You can still get everything you need pretty much from an AP story or Reuters story. I do think for business reporting, Bloomberg does good news. They also do good investigations. Washington Post investigations to me are sort of the ones to beat. But you see good stuff coming out of the LA Times. I like some of what they do. And then some of the magazine stuff, there are pieces that are, really deep dives that sometimes you're like, wow, this is a lot, but then once you get into it, you start reading something in the New Yorker or GQ, for example, and some of the other ones are hit or miss. I'm not here to to slag anybody, but I get my information from so many more different sources now than I used to. It sort of depends on what what flavor I'm in the mood for today. If I have the time to read an Atlantic piece, great. If I need, if I have 5 seconds to figure something out, check out Axios, like flip through that real quick and then move on to the next thing.
And so what I'm hearing from you is that the news business is actually alive and well for the people who want to do it well.
Yeah.
The information is really there. You just got to look for it.
Yeah, and just be willing to check out other news sources. Maybe they're not as sort of entrenched or developed or well known, but I mean, if you live outside of a major city, maybe the big newspaper in your area doesn't cover you anymore. I mean, the first time I heard about Patch, I was like, Patch, what is Patch? Who is Patch? Right? But if you live in, or people in my family don't live in a major metropolis, but they still want to know what's going on, and the local big paper isn't covering them, well, Patch is committed to having somebody there. And I think that taking a little time to figure out who's actually planning to still put boots on the ground for your benefit is definitely a search worth doing.
And even though her family does not live in New York City, they are what our most dedicated listeners of our radio show because we're streaming at WBAI.org, although they don't call in as much as I would like.
They're just fans of yours, man. I mean, they like put up with listening to me, but it's really about you, Jeff.
Well, that's a great place to wind up this conversation. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to segue into our rapid fire question portion of our podcast. This is where we have a little fun. We steal a page from inside the Actors Studio. We ask you a couple of quick questions meant to just elicit a gut reaction answer. So with your indulgence, here we go. Rapid fire question number 1. What is your favorite news source? Celeste?
Jeff is my favorite news source.
I was going to say Celeste's Twitter feed, but I will say New York Times.
All right. Rapid fire question number 2. Your favorite social media platform, Jeff?
Twitter.
Instagram.
All right. Rapid fire question number 3. Coffee or alcohol, Celeste?
I'm trying to lose weight these days, so coffee, but after I hear how bad this tape comes out, probably alcohol.
Iced coffee, black, every day.
Nice. Man after my own heart. Rapid fire question number 4. Your favorite on the run food, Jeff?
String cheese.
Walnuts.
Ooh, 2 new ones. All right. Rapid fire question number 5. What do you want to be after you finish this career, Celeste?
Alive.
I will be in retirement, opening up a coffee shop with a lot of books in the far south side of Chicago in Pullman.
Will dogs be allowed?
Of course.
Okay, I'll see you there.
Done. We have a date. Well, guys, this has been a great conversation. Please let people know how they can find you online and on the radio.
You can find us at WBAI.org or in the New York City metro region at 99.5 FM.
And anything on social media, where can we get you there? On the Twitter, on the Instagram?
Yeah, sure. We are Forces Driving, I think, on Twitter and on Facebook. And then, of course, you can subscribe to us wherever you get your favorite podcasts, including Apple, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and more.
Very good. Well, thank you again, Celeste and Jeff. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Please remember to subscribe to the show, connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The PR Podcast, and send us a question or a comment. Our intro is by Christopher Appold. You can find him and his fantastic photography on Instagram at Christopher_APPOLDT. Check him out and hire him for all your photography needs. You can find me online at Jody Fisher on all the socials and online at jodyfisherpr.com. We'll see you next time on the PR Podcast.